Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The air was thick and metallic as Commander Elena Cruz stepped onto the surface of Cronus, her boots sinking into the powdery orange soil. The planet's surface shimmered with a faint, iridescent light, a sign of the temporal anomalies that had drawn the colonial team here in the first place. Around her, the colony's main structures jutted out from the landscape like metallic teeth, a blend of human engineering and hurried necessity. They had arrived only 6 months ago, but already the settlement was showing signs of wear, if the strange pull of Cronus hadn't warped that perception too. Elena glanced at the sky. 2 suns hung lazily in the distance, their rays crisscrossing in a spectrum of alien colors, but it was hard to gauge how long they'd been there. Time seemed to slither away here, moments blending into days and days into questions that none of her team could yet answer. She made her way to the command center, the looming tower at the heart of their base, where Dr. Marcus Yates would be. Yates had been obsessed with Cronus since their first briefing. It was his theories that had convinced the United Earth Council to approve the expedition. Now, standing on this strange world, Elena wondered if they had ventured too far, sought too much. If the peculiarities they were investigating would end up being the undoing of them all. Inside the command center, the lights flickered, yet another symptom of croissant peculiarity. Elena found Dr. Yates hunched over his desk, surrounded by a maze of holographic projections and data pads. His eyes were wide, feverish with excitement, or perhaps fear. Elena, Yates said without looking up, "I think I've finally cracked it. It's time distortion, it's not random, it's structured, but something's shifting it." Elena approached cautiously. "What do you mean?" Yates straightened, his finger tracing a glowing line on one of the holograms. "At first, we thought the time anomalies were just a planetary quirk, some kind of natural temporal flux. But I've been analyzing the data. There's a pattern here. It's not just the flow of time that's warped, it's expanding." The weight of his words settled over her like a physical force, gradually expanding. Yates nodded, his excitement momentarily giving way to the gravity of the situation. "Yes, and if it continues, the entire planet could become a temporal trap. We could be locked in a loop where minutes stretch into centuries or compress into mere seconds. The distortion is growing outward from a central point, and we need to find it before it consumes us." Elena exhaled slowly. "So you're telling me if we don't fix this, we could get stuck here forever?" "Not forever, exactly," Yates said, shaking his head. "You're right, but close enough." A long silence passed between them. The implications were terrifying. They had come here for exploration, for discovery, but now it seemed they were in a race against a force far beyond their control. And yet, a part of Elena wasn't entirely surprised. Cronus had always felt wrong to her, a place where the laws of reality were warped and frayed. The moment they had landed, she felt the dissonance, like stepping into a dream too vivid to shake. "What's the plan, Yates?" she finally asked, her voice steady, despite the chaos brewing inside her. "I've pinpointed the likely source of the rift, an area in the far southern hemisphere near a series of deep canyons. The temporal anomalies are strongest there. We'll need to go there and investigate in person. I'll need to get closer to the rift to stabilize it. The only way to stop this is to find its core." Elena mulled it over. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but they had no choice. Staying here, waiting for the rift to expand, wasn't an option. "I get a team ready. We leave tomorrow at dawn." Yates gave a quick nod, already retreating into his own thoughts, his mind calculating 1,000 variables. Elena turned on her heel, walking out of the command center and into the open air again. She glanced up at the dual suns, their rays suddenly too sharp, too artificial. Time was slipping away. By the next morning, they were ready. The rover thrummed beneath Elena as she piloted it over the rocky terrain, the endless expanse of Cronus spreading out before them. Dr. Yates sat beside her, furiously analyzing data on his pad, his fingers tapping at an increasingly frantic pace. Behind them, in the second rover, Captain Lin Kuan and Lieutenant Sarah Mendez followed, their figures barely visible through the dust the vehicles kicked up. Kuan's cool confidence was a comfort, but even his relaxed demeanor had been strained by recent events. They had been driving for hours, though. On Cronus, hours didn't mean much anymore. Every mile they covered felt like a leap through time itself, an unpredictable ride that left them all feeling slightly disoriented. As they neared the canyon, the temporal anomalies began to intensify. It started small flickers in the distance, moments where the sky seemed to ripple like water. But as they ventured closer to the rift, Sar's heart, the anomalies became impossible to ignore. Entire sections of landscape shifted, blinking in and out of existence. Alina saw the same tree appear 3 times, each time slightly more decayed than before. "Are you seeing this?" she asked Yates, though she already knew the answer. Yes, Yakul, he whispered, eyes wide. "See, that's worse than I thought." Ahead, the canyon stretched out before them like a jagged scar on the planet's surface. The edges seemed to vibrate as if caught in a temporal tug of war. Alina brought the rover to a halt at the canyon's edge, and the others followed suit. The air was thick with an almost tangible energy, like static before a storm. "This is it," stepping out of the rover. "The epicenter is down there." Alina followed him out, her eyes scanning the canyon below. The rift shimmered in the distance, a pulse of light barely visible to the naked eye. Yet she could feel it. The sheer weight of time seemed to press down on her, a disorienting force that made her head swim. "We'll have to go in on foot from here," Yates said, his voice distant, distracted. He was already lost in the calculations, the possibilities. Alina glanced at Kawan and Mendez, who were unloading the equipment from the second rover. "Everyone ready?" she asked, her voice louder than she intended. Kawan gave her a tight nod, his expression serious. Mendez adjusted the strap on her pack and replied, "Be ready as we'll ever be." They began their descent into the canyon, the ground shifting beneath their feet as the temporal anomalies intensified. Time itself seemed to bend and warp. Alina Ester's computer was useless. The numbers on its screen scrambled beyond recognition. At one point, Kawan stumbled, and Alina swore she saw him freeze mid-fall, suspended for a fraction of a second before he hit the ground. As they reached the canyon floor, the rift came into full view. It was massive, a swirling vortex of energy that tore through the air like a wound in space itself. Alina felt the pull immediately, a sensation that dragged at her very being. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this place and never look back. But they had no choice. This was the source of Tercrona's madness, the heart of the anomaly that threatened to consume them all. Yates stepped forward, his eyes locked on the rift. "This is it, right?" he said, his voice trembling with awe. "This is where we can stabilize the distortion." Alina didn't know how he planned to do it. She was a TA scientist, and the mechanics of time were beyond her. But she trusted Yates, trusted that if anyone could make sense of this nightmare, it was him. "How long will it take?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Not long," Yates replied, his hands shaking as he unpacked a small device from his bag. "But we'll need to be careful. The energy here is unstable. One wrong move, and we could trigger a collapse." Alina nodded, signaling to Kawan and Mendez to stay alert. As Yates began his work, she felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, the vibrations growing stronger with each passing second. Time was running out, and they all knew it. The air around them crackled with energy as Dr. Yates knelt by the shimmering rift, his hands moving frantically over the device he had brought with him. The small machine, an intricate array of wires, nodes, and shimmering crystals, glowed faintly, barely visible against the pulsating light of the rift. Alina watched as Yates muttered to himself, his brow furrowed in concentration. The ground beneath their feet vibrated softly, a constant reminder of the unstable forces they were dealing with. Yates didn't seem to notice the tremors. His mind was completely absorbed in the calculations flashing across his data pad, his fingers trembling as he typed in command. Alina glanced back at Kawan and Mendez, both of whom were standing guard, a few feet away, their eyes scanning the canyon walls for any sign of trouble. She knew they all felt the same time was against them, in more ways than one. "I need more power," Yates said suddenly, his voice breaking the tense silence. He looked up at Alina, desperation in his eyes. "The core isn't responding like I thought it would. We need to increase the energy input, or the rift one, to stabilize it." "How much more power are we talking about?" Alina asked, her voice tight. Yates hesitated, glancing down at the device. "All of it," he said quietly. Alina's stomach dropped. "All of it, Yates. That'll drain the colony's entire power grid. We'd have nothing left. No way to get back. No way to communicate." "I know," Yates cut in, his eyes wide with urgency, "but if we don't do this now, the rift will consume everything. The time distortions will spread beyond this canyon, beyond Cronus. When they'll be stuck here forever, there's no other option." Alina swallowed hard. The weight of the decision pressed down on her. the reality of their situation sinking in, she turned to Kiwan and Mendez, thought. Kasawan's jaw was set, his eyes dark. We came here to fix this. If Yates says it's in the only way, I believe him. Better to burn everything trying than to sit around and wait for the rift to swallow us whole. Mendez nodded in agreement. We'd be already on borrowed time. Was I finished that? Alina took a deep breath, her mind racing. They were out of options. It was either risk everything or lose everything. All right, she said finally, do it. Yates didn't waste a second. He dove back to the machine, his hands flying across the controls as he rerouted power from the colony systems to the device at the rift score. The hum of energy around them grew louder, the vibrations in the ground intensifying. Alina could feel the pressure in the air, like the world itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the rift flared, a burst of blinding light, exploding outward from its center. Alina staggered back, shielding her eyes as the energy surged around them. The canyon walls seemed to ripple, the edges of reality warping under the strain. Time itself felt like it was unraveling, fragments of moments flashing before her, scenes from her past, faces she hadn't seen in years, all blending together in a chaotic blur. Yates, she shouted over the roar of the rift. What's happening? Yates, didn't he respond? He was completely focused on the device, his face bathed in the harsh light of the anomaly. The energy levels were off the charts, the machine struggling to contain the power of the rift. Alina could see the strain in Yates' face, the sheer intensity of what he was trying to control. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them buckled. A deep guttural rumble echoed through the canyon as the earth shifted violently, cracks spidering out from the rift's epicenter. Alina barely managed to keep her balance, her heart pounding in her chest. Kawan and Mendez were thrown to the ground by the force of the tremor, but they scrambled back to their feet, weapons drawn, as if expecting an enemy to materialize from the swirling chaos. Alina knew they were running out of time. Literally, the rift was on the verge of collapsing, and if they didn't destabilize it soon, they'd be swallowed by its destructive force. Yates, she shouted again, her voice hoarse. It's now or never. Yates glanced up at her, his face pale but determined. I am giving it everything, he shouted back. His hands flew over the controls one last time, his eyes locked on the energy readings flashing across the screen. The machine let out a high-pitched whine, the crystals embedded within it glowing brighter and brighter until they were almost blinding. Then, with a deafening crack, the light around the rift intensified, swelling to an unbearable brightness. Alina braced herself, every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for the worst. But instead of chaos, there was silence. The light from the rift dimmed, slowly fading until it was nothing more than a faint glow. The trembling in the ground stopped. The air around them was still. Alina opened her eyes cautiously, half expecting to find herself in some twisted version of reality, but everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as things could be on Corona. Did we do it? Kiwan asked, his voice quiet, almost disbelieving. Yates was staring at the rift, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. I think it worked. Alina didn't dare let herself hope just yet. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes fixed on the rift. The energy it had emitted was still there, but it was contained now, no longer spilling out into the world around them. The temporal distortions were gone. Time, it seemed, had been restored to its proper flow. We need to run diagnostics, Yates said, his voice shaky but relieved. Make sure the rift is stable, but I think we stopped it. Alina exhaled a long, shaky breath, the tension in her body slowly easing. They had done it. They had stopped the rift from consuming them, from trapping them in the twisted fabric of Cronus, fractured time. But as she looked at the faint glow of the rift, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't tried out of the woods yet. Let us get back to the rovers, she said finally, her voice steady. We'll run the diagnostics from base. I don't want to stick around here any longer than we have to. The others nodded in agreement, and together they began the trek back up the canyon wall. The climb was steep, and the air still crackled with residual energy, but the tension had lifted, replaced by a cautious sense of victory. As they reached the top of the canyon, Alina glanced back one last time at the rift. It was still there, a faint pulsing scar on the landscape, but it no longer felt like the monstrous threat it had once been. They had faced the worst of it, and they had survived. But even as they made their way back to the rovers, the uneasy feeling in Alina's gut persisted. The rift was stable for now, but Cronus was still a place where time didn't hold it should. and they were still very much alone on a planet that defied all logic. The journey back to the colony was quiet. No one spoke, each person lost in their own thought. Yates kept glancing at the readings on his pad, his brow furrowed in concentration. Kawan drove in silence, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble, though Elena knew they had faced the worst of it down in the canyon. Mendez sat beside Kawan, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm on her leg, her nerves still on edge. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of the colony that Yates spoke up. "Elena, I think we might have a problem." She turned to look at him, her heart sinking. "What now?" Yates held up his pad, the screen flashing with data that meant nothing to her, but clearly had him on edge. "The rift is stable, but the temporal field around it isn't. Time is still flowing differently on Coronis. The rift might not be expanding anymore, but we were still caught in its effect. If we don't leave soon, we could still get trapped here permanently." Elena clenched her fists, her mind racing. After everything they'd been through, after coming so close to fixing the problem, they were still on the edge of disaster. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yates shook his head slowly. "Not unless we can figure out how to reverse the planet, Samflow, entirely, and I don't even know where to begin with that." For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of Yates' words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They had stopped the rift, but they hadn't solved the deeper problem. Time on Toronis was still broken, and unless they found a way to fix it, they were all living on borrowed time. Elena took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. They weren't done yet. The fight for survival wasn't over.